Hi everyone, welcome to Stories to Watch 2024. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ani Dasgupta. I'm the President and CEO of World Resources Institute. There are nearly 2,000 of us spread across 5 continents, working with our partners to solve the world's toughest challenges in the intersection of people, nature, and climate. Every January, we gather our experts to identify the biggest shifts and the critical decisions that will be made this year that impacts our work and the world. We hope these stories will not only help you understand what is happening as the year unfolds, but why. And more importantly, how it connects to the bigger picture. We won't be WRI if we didn't start with some facts and figures. So here are 3. First, 2023 was the hottest year ever recorded. In fact, the last 9 years were all the hottest on record. Climate change is here, now. Second, the UN's Global Stocktake report found that we need to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030 to stay within safe limits of warming. Yet, current commitments put us on track to less than 10% of reduction. The System Change Lab, which looks at real change in the economy and not commitments, similarly found out of 42 indicators, only just one, was on track to achieve 2030 targets. Clearly, we are far behind in the fight against climate change. Third, 2023 saw exponential progress in electric mobility and renewable energy. We need every sector to reach a tipping point like these to unleash a new era of low-carbon prosperity. If we make the right choices to shift the systems that make up our economy, we can course correct. The real question is, who will make these choices and where? This year, 2024, is a year of elections. If you look at the map behind me, countries like United States, Mexico, the UK, India, Indonesia, all are holding elections. These countries make up over half the world's population. Billions of people will be making serious choices about how they want to be governed and what their leaders' priorities should be. 2024 is the most important election year so far in this century, and it is happening in the middle of a climate crisis. We know elections make a difference for the fate of our planet. Mid-year last year, Brazil reported that deforestation in Brazilian Amazon had fallen by 22%, and further updates suggested it continued to decline. This decrease is seen as a sign that President Lula's policies to curb deforestation are already taking effect. One of our stories to watch from last year. The good news is that nearly every country now sees climate change as a serious threat they must act upon. In December, we saw the power of collective action on the world stage at COP28 in Dubai. Each country had to weigh the interests of its own citizens and businesses with those of the global community. The final agreement of COP28 to transition away from fossil fuel while tripling the world's renewable energy capacity by 2030 was a hard-fought step forward. This looks like great progress. However, global agreements don't always result in real change. Success actually depends on the national policies and decisions that turn them into action. I've just come back from India, where I grew up. Life there is changing fast. The country is on track to achieve its ambitious goal of 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2030. It also saw the fastest growth of any major economy last year. Yet, India is still struggling to create enough jobs for its young and growing workforce and cater to the needs of significant population of urban and rural poor. Soon, 900 million Indians will go to the polls to select a new national government. How will politicians wrestle with the immense challenges, such as reducing India's reliance on coal while generating enough energy for the economic growth and jobs that are critically needed? This political dimension is the challenge in every country. There is no single lever that leaders can pull to make changes happen. 2024 demands that politicians across the globe make bold climate choices. However, they need to be able to explain these choices in a way that convinces the majority that their lives will be better off. At its heart, this year's Stories to Watch is about the balance between ambitious national climate action and the ability to bring their citizens along. This is the art and the science of the new climate politics. So join me on this journey as we walk through 4 stories to watch this year about the politics of climate change and the key system changes needed to make the transition a reality. For our first story, we are visiting the Netherlands, which is facing exactly these national political challenges. It's a climate-vulnerable country with centuries-long history of managing a fraught relationship with nature. It's also a wealthy country, one of the richest in the world, and has a record of taking bold climate action. But even the Netherlands is finding the politics of climate change difficult. Let's hear from my colleague Stintje in the Dutch countryside.
This is the Maaslandkering, one of the big infrastructural designs to keep the Netherlands dry. It is also the region where I live, the typical Dutch polder landscape of canals and fields, dikes and windmills. It's also the region that hosts world-class industries, innovative water infrastructures such as these massive locks behind me, and highly efficient farms that make this actually tiny country the second largest agricultural exporter in the world. But this landscape is being threatened by climate change, and not just because of the potential of sea level rise. Because the Netherlands also has some of Europe's great rivers running through these countries, like the Rhine and the Maas. Part of the country is actually a massive delta of connected rivers. And in June 2021, we came very close to important inundations in the south of the country because of a massive rainfall that turned even secondary rivers into an angry flood. The Dutch know how vulnerable this country is, and we know that climate change matters. So the Dutch has therefore been at the forefront of climate action and climate adaptation. And we figured out how the shift to a low-carbon economy brings opportunities like clean air, cheap energy, new industries and jobs. But recently, we've also seen a backlash against climate and nature protection actions, just as we've seen it in other countries in Europe and around the world. Because ordinary people who are struggling with inflation and high fuel costs, they are concerned that they will not be able to afford climate action such as house insulation or heat pumps. Over the last few years, hundreds of farmers have driven their giant tractors onto the streets around the Dutch Parliament in The Hague, just 20 kilometers away from where I'm standing now. They were there to make sure their voices and their fears are being heard. Many voters here and elsewhere in Europe are now considering such issues when they take part in elections. There is a new political dimension. It's not that most people don't believe that climate change is taking place. What's happening now is that governments are making political choices about how they are going to fulfill their promises about reaching net zero, how they are going to make this historic systemic shift to economies running on clean energy. But the facts are very clear. Avoiding a worsening climate crisis is better on all accounts. But how to connect that to the challenges of today and across different groups that do not all benefit equally? That is why the first story in WRI's Stories to Watch 2024 is about climate change, about the measures we need if we're to try to get near to 1.5 degrees of global warming, and about the backlash against climate action.
The story Stintje just outlined is playing out around the world. In 2024, voters will make choices that will determine how climate policy will look like in their countries. These choices are going to quite literally shape the future of our planet. Most importantly, each country will have to ensure that this transition is fast enough and at the same time fair. Wealthy nations like Germany or the UK need to manage challenges like changing energy prices or new farming practices. Developing countries need to rapidly transition the energy system so they can benefit from low-carbon growth. And fossil fuel producers, like Norway, Saudi Arabia, or the United States, have to find other sources of prosperity in a low-carbon world. If the world is going to exponentially accelerate the needed transition, we need leaders to develop a new climate politics that emphasizes the opportunities, but also identifies and assists those who will find the transition more difficult. The new climate economy research finds that strong climate action can lead up to 65 million good jobs by 2030. But the jobs will change. The industries we know now will be disrupted, and many will worry how this impacts them. These issues will look different in every country, but there are two crucial developments to watch for. First, what role will climate policy play domestically when voters go to poll? And how will candidates frame the benefit of the new climate economy? And second, how will elected leaders prioritize support for other countries' climate action? Let's look at examples of how this is playing out domestically in different countries. First, the United States recently passed 3 laws that make up the biggest package of climate legislation in its history. The Inflation Reduction Act, the centerpiece climate legislation, was designed and presented as an initiative to create jobs, make the U.S. economy more competitive, and reduce inflation. It promised to create 9 million jobs in just 10 years. It also promised to spend 40 cents of every dollar on vulnerable and low-income communities to ensure that this transition is just. In this critical election year, the world will be watching how candidates position the economic opportunities and cost of climate action to voters. Will the promise of the new climate economy and a safer world engage voters, or will they fear what the transition means for them? Second, Indonesia. Indonesia has negotiated $20 billion just economy transition partnership with 9 wealthy countries and the EU that promises to shift its economy away from fossil fuel dependence. It has also reduced its primary forest loss by 64% in recent years. The current president strives to position Indonesia as a climate leader of the world. In the final stretch of this election season, will the candidates embrace this agenda and present a vision for stronger climate action? Will these policies continue under the new administration? In all these elections, leaders need to ensure that the benefits of the transition are spread widely. One of the biggest reasons we are seeing a backlash is that people feel they may be left behind. We will be watching to see if leaders pledge support to workers, providing retraining and compensation packages, and ensuring that they can take advantage of the new clean energy jobs. These elections are not only important domestically, but they're also important for multilateral processes. Elected leaders, especially in wealthy countries, will face the significant additional challenge of allocating substantially more resources to support emerging economies. This is a fair expectation and is part of the Paris Agreement. For example, vulnerable countries face devastating climate-related damages, and the $700 million in early pledges for loss and damage fund is just a drop in the ocean compared to $580 billion these countries will need by 2030. Climate action, including energy transition, will not happen in emerging countries at the speed and scale necessary without significantly more support from wealthy countries. This will come to a head in November when 198 countries gather in Azerbaijan for the next COP to agree to how much money wealthy countries are willing to put on the table for emerging countries. Delivering on this won't be easy, as the richest countries themselves face their own economic challenges and increasing cost of conflict and migration. At the UN summit, watch to see how countries with very different priorities find common ground on what is needed and how much can be delivered. The decisions made at the ballot box this year will determine whether the world can stay within a 1.5 degree of warming. We need to see a new politics of climate, and 2024 will play a decisive role in what the future holds. Our second story is one that we don't think enough about when we think about climate change: shifting food and land systems. Food plays a central role in each of our lives and is one of the greatest opportunities for effective climate action in 2024. For example, in Kenya, it's a pillar of the economy. 40% of the population has jobs connected to agriculture, producing domestic staples like maize, cash crops like tea, coffee, mangoes. The country is also one of the only few in the world with a constitutional mandate to protect and restore its forest. Let's hear from Manjura Mathai in Nairobi.
This is City Market right at the heart of Nairobi, my hometown. This is where we bought our vegetables, our fruits, our flowers, our meats. And it was farmers and people like Mutua who would wake up at the crack of dawn to travel right here to this market as far as 20 kilometers to sell their fresh produce, some of the most beautiful fresh produce anywhere. This was a near daily ritual to secure lives and livelihoods. Now, food systems are central to human life and our impact on the planet. It affects land use, forest loss, rural development, and is a source of livelihoods. The food in this market comes from all over Kenya and even East Africa. The truth is, the fruits and vegetables you see here are part of a massive value chain. You could walk into a supermarket in Europe and find Mutua's green beans and his mangoes right here from Kenya, avocados from Mexico, blueberries from South Africa, and lamb from places as far as New Zealand. Today's food systems are vast and incredible, and they have enormous environmental footprints. 30% of greenhouse gas emissions are connected with the food system. But the story to watch here is the central role of food systems like these in driving climate change and at the same time securing lives and livelihoods. So how do we fix a system, make it more productive and better for the environment and more equitable? The truth is, if we don't succeed, then climate change will make things even worse for families and for lives. Now, here in Kenya, the food system is extremely vulnerable. Out in the countryside, we're already seeing the impacts of climate change. We have extreme weather events, livestock is dying, crops are failing and soils are eroding, and pure water sources are becoming more and more depleted. But it's businessmen like Mutua who are facing the brunt of this the most, either as smallholder farmers or families that are supported by these businesses living on the edge. And yet we also know that if we produce differently, protect soils, reduce waste, and restore landscapes, we can make food systems work better for a real contribution to fighting climate change. Practices that improve agriculture and food security will ensure more productive farms and accrue benefits of restoring key landscapes. That is why the food systems agenda is WRI's second story to watch for 2024.
That was Wanjira in Nairobi. Food systems connect people, nature, and climate in every country of the world. But the current system is dysfunctional for three reasons. First, it's failing to feed the world's people. Although we produce enough food to feed everyone today, hundreds of millions still face hunger. And over 30% of food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted. Second, As Banjira pointed out, even as climate change increasingly threatens agriculture, food systems are responsible for 34% of global emissions. However, the current patterns of consumption are deeply unequal, with the global north eating far more meat and dairy per person than other parts of the world. Third, the way we produce food and fiber requires an enormous amount of land and water. Commodities like beef, soy, and palm oil drive around 3/4 of tropical deforestation and biodiversity loss. The food system clearly needs a massive overhaul. But this transition is also highly political. Food is deeply woven into our lives and culture, and it is at the heart of our national identities. Almost half the world's people live in households where someone is employed in the food system. In India, 44% of the population work in agriculture. This political and social importance helps explain why governments across the world spend more than $700 billion a year on direct farm subsidies. Much of that money could be redirected to make the food system work much more sustainably. Countries could learn from Brazil, where loans to farmers were linked to curbing deforestation, or to Kenya, where government programs help smallholder dairy farmers boost their productivity using improved grasses to feed their animals. Reorienting subsidies is one of the commitments made by countries in a historic outcome on food at COP28 in Dubai. 159 countries signed the Emirates Declaration, agreeing to integrate food and agriculture into their national climate plans by 2025, scale up adaptation and resilience for farmers, and much more. And a group of ambitious countries called the Alliance of Champions for Food Systems Transformation announced they would go even further, committing to take a whole-of-government approach to food system change. The biggest thing to watch for in food systems is how countries revise their climate plans to incorporate the Emirates Declaration on Food. But that will not happen until COP30 in Belém next year. Countries need to make progress this year to get ready for Belém. So what to watch for this year? 4 big shifts need to happen, and many are highly political. First, produce. We must produce more food on the land we currently use. As we look for more innovative ways to increase productivity, there is also a major opportunity to reduce emissions from agriculture. Emissions from sources like cows and sheep and paddy fields where rice is grown are responsible for nearly half of all methane emissions globally. Methane is among the most harmful planet-heating gases. More than 150 countries have pledged to cut methane emission by 30% by 2030. At COP28, these countries, along with philanthropists and businesses, announced hundreds of millions of dollars for methane reduction in the food and agriculture sector. Will this new funding and research lead to technological breakthroughs in 2024? Will we see countries or companies' agriculture methane emission begin to fall? Second, protect. Watch for countries to make progress on protecting nature by stopping commodity-driven deforestation. As I've said, Indonesia has steadily reduced deforestation for several years through bold policies. Will these trends continue across the globe? For example, will the re-election of the current president of DRC mean that he will continue his vision of a new climate economy for the Congo Basin? And will the international community step up to meet President Lula's call for billions of dollars of new finance to protect forests? Third, reduce. This will be an important year for nations to reduce pressure on food systems through changes in consumption patterns. For example, the EU introduced a proposal for the world's first legally binding target to limit food loss and waste in 2023. Will member states show leadership by agreeing to the targets and proposing national legislation to make them a reality? Denmark and South Korea announced national action plans to drive production and consumption of plant-based food. Will this accelerate a transformation of their food systems and prove popular among consumers? In 2024, will countries introduce policies that further expand biofuels and bioenergy? Or will they finally recognize the harmful effects of dedicating cropland to energy use and start to cut back. Lastly, restore. In Africa, 260 million people rely on the land for food and income, but far too much is degraded. To bring those land back to productivity, countries across Africa have committed to restore more than 100 million hectares with a focus on creating jobs and improving livelihoods for farmers. Leaders in Ghana, Kenya, and Ethiopia have taken steps to transform their commitments into real policies and incentives. Will more heads of state in Africa and around the world follow suit this year? The food and land system has enormous potential as a solution to the climate crisis, if we can summon the courage, the money, and the ideas to make change happen. Bold national policies are needed to turn the Emirates Declaration into real action that makes the food we all rely on better for people and for nature. The next story is about energy. For years now, climate change discussions have focused on energy transition, and for the right reasons. 75% of global emissions come from burning fossil fuels. But there hasn't been enough attention on the grid, the wires, towers, and substations which deliver this energy to the users. We cannot decarbonize the power sector without modernizing the electricity grid, a difficult problem that encompasses large investments, policies, land, and technology. The US has made among the most far-reaching promises on decarbonizing its energy system, but also has some of the biggest challenges on the grid. Let's hear from Jenny Chen, who is just outside Washington, D.C. in the United States.
Electricity is the lifeblood of the modern economy, and the power sector is key to reducing greenhouse gas and other harmful emissions to benefit human health and safety, as well as economic opportunity. When it comes to the clean energy transition, most people think of wind turbines, solar panels, efficient appliances, and electric vehicles. These are all important, but what's missing? If electricity is a lifeblood, then the transmission networks are the critical arteries connecting clean energy with the people who use it. In fact, the electric transmission grids are considered the world's largest machines. For example, the US grid carries electricity across well over 1 million kilometers of high voltage transmission lines. It's impressive, but like other things built in the last century, it's due for a reboot. Historically, the transmission grid was built up from the local level and wasn't planned for the purpose of sharing resources across broad geographies. Unlike the US interstate highway system that forms the backbone of the US transportation network, the transmission grid was constructed piecemeal and has many missing links. A robust network is important when one region experiences power shortages, for example, due to gas supply interruptions or extreme winter weather. During emergencies, neighboring regions can help send extra electricity. Further, low-cost, emissions-free clean energy that does not rely on fuel, but relies on weather can also be shared with neighbors, depending on who has sunshine and wind. We are in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, but these infrastructure needs and challenges are present throughout the world. For example, solar generation dominates during the day and in summer. There is more wind at night and during winter, and hydropower can store excess renewable generation for later use. Determining who pays for high upfront costs of large infrastructure is another big hurdle. In addition, how to share transmission project benefits with those who pay for the infrastructure, whether financially or more indirectly through hosting energy projects on their land, is another contentious topic. These challenges are not insurmountable, and we are seeing progress that is hard-won by diligently working toward win-win solutions between neighboring states. Further, we can leverage newer transmission technologies to increase the capacity on any given line of right-of-way, reduce energy loss through the lines, and control electricity flow given real-time monitoring of system conditions. We can also better use existing lines by improving how electricity is traded between regions. We have many solutions for building more capacity to transport clean energy using less resources and land. It is critical to modernize the electric grid to enable exchange of clean, affordable, and reliable electricity. That is why the electricity grid is a story to watch in 2024.
That was Jenny Chen, just outside Washington, D.C. This story is about plugging clean energy generation into the clean energy economy. Worldwide, we have seen enormous progress with generation. The global share of wind and solar in electricity generation has been growing at an average rate of 14%, and that's set to increase. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, says the renewables are set to become the world's biggest source of electricity within 3 years. This is good news. But to meet the 1.5-degree goal, we need to further accelerate the generation of clean energy, including a tripling of the world's renewable energy capacity by 2030. Grids are especially important for renewables. With fossil fuels, you could transport the fuel via trains, ships, or pipelines and generate the electricity where you need it, say close to a city. With renewables, you have to generate where you have sun or the wind. So the grid is even more important to bring clean energy to its final users. But there is a problem. Those connections are not happening at the necessary speed or scale. The IEA says that about 18 million kilometers of new or upgraded power lines will be needed by 2040 for national clean energy goals to be met. Without an expanded and modernized grid to carry the clean energy, the transition will remain piecemeal and inefficient. The grid story is just as relevant in the global south. In Africa, fewer than 60% of people are connected to the national grid, and this varies widely across the continent. As you can see from the map behind me, South Africa is 89% connected, while the picture is much different in Niger, with only 16%. In 2021, 40% of all the electricity produced in Nigeria, the country with the largest GDP in Africa, was from private generators. That's expensive, horrible for the environment, and a massive health hazard. With the modernized grid, we get more secure energy, less reliance on expensive stopgap solutions like generators, and cleaner air. However, there's a real political challenge. Grids have a massive upfront cost, and it can take years before the benefits of the investment are realized. Because the grid is an integral part of a system, it needs to be combined with other elements, such as complex policies that regulate wholesale and consumer energy market. And expanding the grid requires land, sometimes across jurisdictions and borders. We know that expensive long-term projects that require significant investments combined with policies are hard for politicians to tackle. But budget choices about grids made by politicians now can unleash the benefit of the clean energy revolution for decades to come. Researchers in the US found that an investment of $98 billion in transmission, distribution, and storage would generate over $165 billion in just the first 5 years. So, what's to watch for in 2024? First, watch how individual countries and their leaders will frame and prioritize increasing investment on their grid. Uruguay, for example, invested $1 billion in modernizing its grid, building the infrastructure that led to 85% of energy coming from renewables. In just 1 decade, wind went from just 1% of electricity generation to a third, with hydropower remaining the main source. How did Uruguay's politicians do it? They committed to the project and built a framework of supportive laws and regulation. Markets were rejected to provide better incentives. The result? Reliable, clean power. And cheap too. The electricity price fell by a third between 2010 and 2022. Will more countries prioritize grid and reform and investment like Uruguay? Second, look for multi-jurisdictional projects that connect across states and national borders. This makes them more efficient and can reduce carbon dioxide emission by 10% alone. But such cooperations can be politically more difficult. In Asia, just 3% of electricity is cross-border. But in Europe, nearly a tenth of electricity is already cross-border. Last year, the European Union laid out an action plan for grid to create a more digitized, decentralized, and flexible system with double the amount of cross-border infrastructure. In the US, the potential gain for trans-border transmission system is enormous. However, institutional barriers and incentives have to be reworked so the individual states are better able to coordinate their transmission projects. Third, securing land to build grid infrastructure can be intensely controversial and may result in long, drawn-out legal battles. In Europe, it can take 8 years to get a grid connection permit, and in the US, it can be even longer. Will countries prioritize this reform? Innovation in this area is already happening. Britain, as seen in the picture behind me, is reworking its energy governance model to streamline grid connections and has a proposal to compensate people living near the power line with thousands of their energy bills. Finally, there are innovative technological solutions that are politically less difficult than rebuilding an entire grid. Digitizing a grid and using artificial intelligence helps to organize flows of electricity, routing them more efficiently through the network. Markets and utilities can be incentivized and encouraged to reward such investments. Because line capacity can depend on the weather conditions, simply monitoring wire temperatures also helps to optimize flows. In Texas, changing the wires on nearly 400 kilometers of existing grid doubles its capacity and cut electricity loss by 40%. This benefited both consumers and the environment. Bills fell by $30 million in the first year in operation, and the wires saved carbon emission equivalent to 34,000 cars. The economic opportunity promised by a clean energy revolution is enormous. Yet the potential of a clean energy economy can only be unlocked if the world's biggest machines connect users to produce of clean electricity efficiently and affordably. Grid investment will also allay fears about energy security that have only grown with the conflict in Ukraine. In the US, some have argued that more fossil fuel investment will increase energy security. More fossil fuels will increase long-term risk to the economy, create stranded assets, destroy nature, worsen our health, and further damage our environment. Better grids are a virtuous cycle of greater demand for electrification and greater supply of clean energy. The choices that have to be made need leadership from government. That means committing money, building public-private partnerships, work with civil society and NGOs to craft win-win solutions. Once again, politics and leadership will matter. This story is about human impact of climate change, how we adapt to it, and the politics that is needed. Last year was the hottest year on record, and heat kills people. It is a silent, often unnoticed killer, and this makes it a politically even more difficult challenge. India's cities are particularly vulnerable to extreme heat, especially for nearly half the urban population who live in informal settlements. Here is Jaya in Bengaluru to tell us more.
This is Rajajinagar, an industrial estate in Bengaluru's urban core. As you can see, the activity is warming up. There's some construction happening in the background. Places like these are a mix of formal and informal workers, construction, traffic in the midst of the hustle-bustle of a big city. It doesn't look hot now, but when it's high summer and the temperature climbs, heat in this city, which was known to have a temperate and mild climate, becomes intense. And as record after record for heat waves around the world are broken, thanks to climate change, the problem is set to get worse. Here in Bangalore, we often get temperatures over 30 degrees Celsius. But over the last 5 years, we've had several instances of temperatures breaching 35 degrees Celsius, inducing heat stress, especially in vulnerable, sensitive and exposed populations. This year, the hottest day was over 37 degrees. That's almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit. When you think of climate change impacts, it's easy to think of disasters like hurricanes and cyclones, bushfires and rising sea levels. Heat that way is a silent killer, but compared to other extreme weather events, the impacts of heat and the deaths it causes are often hidden and hard to count, diminishing its political salience. The most authoritative figure on the issue suggests that at least 500,000 people die of heat every year, but we'll never know the true figures. What we do know is that a combination of ever higher temperatures and more of the world's population moving into urban areas like Bangalore mean the number of those affected will only go up. Heat affects poor people and low-income areas far worse than richer areas. For instance, research from WRI India shows that informal settlements in some Indian cities can be up to 6 degrees Celsius hotter than neighboring areas. The problem is that poor areas tend to become more crowded, with less space for air circulation. It's even worse in slums and informal settlements where building materials used are cheaper, less resistant to sun or rain, often amplifying the effects of ambient temperatures. As global temperatures rise, the need to deal with extreme heat is only getting urgent. And although heat waves in the developed world have also killed thousands, the burden will once again fall most heavily on the shoulders of the poor and vulnerable, especially in cities like Bengaluru. That is why heat is the fourth WRI Stories to Watch for 2024.
That was Jaya in Bengaluru, India's third biggest city and the tech capital with a population of 13 million people. The last two stories I've talked about focus on systems, investments, and policies. These are crucial. But this story is different. It's about human life, about people dying. Heat kills. More than 60,000 people are known to have been killed by Europe's summer heat wave in 2022. Worldwide, as Jaya just said, research suggests that there are more than 500,000 heat-related deaths a year. The real figure is doubtless far higher, as so many deaths from heat are by their nature often invisible. Heat also is more fatal for low-income and marginalized communities. Tornadoes, wildfires are far more dramatic, and you can see them in the strike. Politicians are much less likely to respond to a hidden killer that rarely captures the news headlines. If a problem goes unreported, it will likely continue unaddressed. So, what to watch for in heat this year? This is about lives, the voices and the rights of the poor and marginalized communities around the world, whether in India or in the United States. In the US, 1,700 people died from heat-related causes in 2022, and likely more last year. This is the US, one of the richest countries in the world, where 90% of people have access to cooling. In contrast, in Southeast Asia, only 15% of households had air conditioning in 2019. The elderly, outdoor workers, and people with no access to cool air are at greatest risk. The next thing to watch for in the story is how cities and local governments deal with this issue. Politics at this level tends to be more pragmatic and focus on solutions rather than ideology. And big cities are often ahead of national government. City leaders at this level of government are getting much needed attention from the climate community. At the Local Government Summit at COP28 last year, world leaders agreed to incorporate local government action into national climate commitments. This means grassroots and community groups and governments coming together, as they have done in Ahmedabad, India. Among other steps, they have planted trees, painted roofs white, and this has made a massive difference, especially for women who often work from their homes. Local action works best with good coordination between different levels of government. For instance, cities may not be able to influence building codes, while national governments can't really advance urban greening. Will national, provincial, and local governments coordinate action for maximum impact? Third, look for policies that encourage the use of design, alternative materials, and nature-based solutions to cool neighborhoods and cities. These solutions are often less politically controversial and do not increase energy use in its operations. As we heard from Jaya, choices about materials and structures can make a big difference in urban heat, and passive cooling can play a huge role. Allowing air to flow reduces temperature. In addition, nature-based solutions like planting trees can have a huge cooling impact. For example, in Medellin, Colombia, the city planted over 800,000 trees in green corridors, helping to reduce temperature in the city by 2 degrees. Even when air conditioning is used, higher efficiency in buildings and cooling technology can have a huge climate impact. Energy efficiency has the biggest mitigation potential per dollar spent. Watch how countries incorporate doubling energy efficiency, as they agreed in Dubai, and implement policies that encourage passive cooling and nature-based solutions in new climate plans. Lastly, we need to see a renewed emphasis on adaptation as the world gets steadily hotter. Yet, progress on the global goal of adaptation has been slow. Partly this is because solutions to adaptations are dependent on local condition. Watch how we advance the global goal for adaptation and whether the world makes much needed progress on financial commitments for locally led adaptation. Heat kills. This is an area where governments must lead, working with civil society and local communities. After all, if governments have one sacred duty, it is to protect the lives of its citizens. Yet around the world, thousands of people are dying from the impact of climate change. And this problem will only get worse as the world gets hotter. The poor and the marginalized communities suffer the most from impacts like heat. These are families that have little access to cooling and are forced to work outside in extreme heat to keep their families fed. These are the same people who did little to create this problem. Effective solutions exist, but they will only work if local governments work with communities to craft hyper-local solutions, and national level governments work with cities to support these city-level actions, as we saw in Medellin. Richer countries that cause this additional heat and have benefited from centuries of fossil fuel use have a critical role to play. They must step up later this year to support vulnerable countries in adaptation investment. Choosing to act is a political decision, and so is choosing to ignore the problem. These were our 4 stories on the politics of responding to the biggest existential challenge of our time. The political challenge is to realize national pathways to what the science tells us is necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. This will include historical shifts to the system that underpin our economy and our shared prosperity. The impact of climate change are unfairly distributed. The benefit of climate change can also be unfairly distributed, but they don't need to be. Choices matter. If we succeed, the outcome will be transformational for people, for nature, for climate. If we get this right, not only will we have a decarbonized economy, thriving nature, cleaner air, better health, but also 65 million new jobs and $26 trillion added to our economy just by 2030. Our lives will be exponentially better. That is what we're working on at WRI. We're focused on 3 system changes: food, energy, and cities, and the country-level transitions that underpin them. The stories you heard today are based on the work by WRI experts across the world. But more critically, we strive every day to equip leaders in government and businesses with the most evidence-based, most compelling, ground-tested case for ambitious climate action. I hope I've convinced you, even a little bit, that the most important battle for climate action may not be at large global gatherings like the COP, but rather at polling booths across the world. But the elections are not the only time we vote. Every decision we make is a vote. What we eat, what we buy, and what we consume. You're voting every day with the choices you make. So choose wisely. Thank you so much for joining us.